and see and hear this presentation. So first of all, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Ophelia. You will see if you're joining us here, there are multiple ways to enjoy this presentation. If you are on the web page, you will see that if there are technical difficulties, there is a link below the page and where this video is streaming. You'll see that you can click on that Zoom link underneath and join us back in case you're having difficulties with the live stream. This is all being recorded and we will share this later on the same web page. And if you've registered for this event, you will also be sent the full recording so you can enjoy it and share it with all of your loved ones. We also, at the bottom, you'll see we have some caption options. So you can, if you are on the pih.org/GDOA page, you will see that below the video, there are two orange buttons. One says hide captions, the other says English. So if you are interested in the caption option, you can press the English and down will drop many different options. So we have today French, Spanish, Russian, and Haitian Creole options, as well as English. So please choose those if you would like to have this conversation captioned in another language. All right, I think that is our housekeeping notes, Tracy and Ophelia. I am so excited to have you here. And today is, as you know, Paul's birthday, October 26th. We're celebrating Paul's legacy. Activism through action is our conversation today. And I want to really just tell people about this day. So many months ago, we were thinking about how can we honor Paul on his birthday? And really, we thought we want to remember him because Paul believed in taking action. So why not do that? Why not celebrate and honor Paul every year if we can through that theme? And we want to recommit to our work, really focus our efforts to drive forward the movement for health as a human right. So thank you for joining us all. And as a reminder, we will be sharing this recording. Before we jump into our conversation, Tracy and Ophelia, we have a video to share. Ophelia will recognize the speaker here, but I would love my colleagues to please play the Global Day of Action video, and then we'll jump into conversation.
When my friend Paul talked about global health, he often talked about failures of imagination. It wasn't that the best treatments didn't work for the poorest, sickest patients, or that world-class hospitals couldn't be built in impoverished areas.
This is going to be the waiting area and medical records area. So you can see it's going to be very nice. Imagine this, all polished up.
It was a failure of imagination. A failure to imagine and pursue a world where all patients everywhere had access to the highest standard of care. A world where no patient died of a treatable disease or stayed sick because they couldn't afford care. Paul not only imagined this world, he dedicated his life to making it a reality.
This is my professional and vocational obsession, and it has been my whole life.
For more than 30 years, Partners in Health has carried that mission forward, treating thousands of patients, training hundreds of clinicians, partnering with governments to improve health systems, and calling for global policy change.
What could be better than being an activist? It's something you're doing because you want to do it. It's something you choose to do. So I think that's a big deal, being an activist.
We are guided by Paul's vision and grounded in community. We do this work through partnership and accompaniment, being there together as long as it takes. As we continue the work that Paul started, we know that the best way to honor him is through action. A better world is possible.
It's a good time for us to remember that we need to really, really pull together.
Join us in taking action for global health equity. Together, we can carry on Paul's vision for healthcare as a human right.
Thank you. Thank you, Ophelia, again, for helping us with that project. And welcome again. So a little introductions. Ophelia and Tracy, you know each other very well, but for everyone listening and watching us today, Ophelia Dahl is our PIH co-founder and chair of the board of directors. Thank you very much for joining us, Ophelia. Tracy Kidder is a PIH trustee and best-selling author and Pulitzer Prize winner. He's the author of Mountains Beyond Mountains, and I have my copy here. Thank you very much, Tracy. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm really excited to dive in. So the first question we have is, we know that you two have been very good friends for many years now, and you have a common friendship in Paul. So can you remember that first time you met him? Ophelia, I'm going to direct this to you here first. And maybe most importantly, what were your first impressions?
You're right, Leslie. I do remember that time very well, vividly. But I thought, given that today is his birthday, it might make sense to think about not just the first impressions that he made upon us, but also think about the first impressions that were made upon him. And, that without question is his family of origin. And I just want to make sure that on this day, that we think about them and the impression that he made on them, because there's absolutely no question that that family that was so filled with love and humor and extraordinary connectiveness, and that they stayed close always and expanded out into a bigger family, that helped to shape him. I have this on my desk now, so I just want to share it, but this is Paul and his mom not too long ago. And I know that a day like today is probably particularly difficult for her, but it was those early connections and I think that they all feel part of this work and have been intimately connected. So having said that, the first impressions made on me, I was young, 18 or so, and I just remember being blown away by his compassion, interest in everything. And we spent a morning together on the back of a Land Rover. And after I got over my suspicion of why this guy was here in my patch, if you like, he was enormously winning. I mean, this was a thing that he did so beautifully, was that he just made great friends with everyone. But I watched him watching, and that's what I remember very vividly, as he took in all of the surroundings and wanted then to talk about it with me. So it was that strength of connection and his compassion and, of course, his humor. We stayed up all night that first night, laughing. And that carried on, throughout the next 40 years.
Thank you, Ophelia. And Tracy, do you remember? I know you do, because
I remember quite vividly, I guess because I wrote about it, and that's the way I remember it now. But I think it was accurate. I was in Haiti to write about these American soldiers. I was hanging around with a group of special forces soldiers, and especially with this captain who described himself as a redneck from Alabama. I liked the guy tremendously. He had really been trying to do a good thing there, and he and his men hadn't been given any tools. Anyway, one night Paul showed up, and he started asking the captain rather pointed questions about a case. There'd been a horrible murder, and a political murder, and Paul, the captain and his men had arrested the prime suspect, but they couldn't find anyone to testify against him, which isn't surprising. So they'd let him go, and Paul had come to warn. I didn't realize what he'd come to do, but Paul had come to say, you're losing the faith of the people around you. But he did it in such a way that it struck me as pretty, aggressive and kind of mean. Not really mean exactly, but what he was saying was, and then somehow the conversation got into the School of the Americas at Fort Benning in Georgia, and it sort of devolved. And when after Paul left, I thought, who's this guy? Is he Mr. Self-Righteous? I met him later on the plane back, I went home for Christmas that year, and he was supposed to sit in first class, where not because he paid for it, but because he took care of patients on planes. And so I was sitting he let me sit down with him, and he began to explain things to me, and it was really interesting. I was so confused about everything that I had seen, and he was wonderfully generous. And also he explained to me, look, I know that captain isn't responsible for the bad decisions made in Washington. I just wanted to warn him. I still think that Paul could have used a little bit of diplomacy, but it worked out all right. And I think in a way the captain was probably grateful, because he had only 8 men that were trying to keep the peace among hundreds of thousands of people. Anyway, that was it. And so I ended up liking him quite a bit after that, because in fact, we got off in Miami, and I went and had some coffee or some, and I almost missed my flight home because I was having such a good time chatting with him.
That sounds about right. Paul did have a wonderful gift to hold a conversation. And Tracy, the next question is for you. You documented some of the ways Paul had a superhuman capacity to work and travel. You were along for that ride for years, right? In researching and then writing Mountains Beyond Mountains, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. Congratulations. It's amazing work. One thing you observed about him was his encyclopedic knowledge. And if you knew Paul, it was impressive. I love what you said recently about Paul, that he had a memory palace built on patience. Can you elaborate on that? I think that's such a lovely way to phrase it.
Thanks. I began to realize this on many airplane flights we took together. He would quiz me about things about TB and so on. And in the spirit of revenge, I tried to find the names of some really bizarre infectious diseases and see if I could stump him. I remember I settled on something called tropical sprue, and of course he knew more about it than I had found in the textbooks, which was very disappointing. But talking with him, watching him on rounds at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, I don't have time to tell you these dramatic stories of saving people's lives, people who were about to be put in hospice, and Paul saying, "Nah, it's going to get better. I know it's wrong." He really was amazing. But little by little, for instance, when I first saw him doing a spinal tap, I must have asked him, "What was the first? Do you remember the first one you did?" And he absolutely did. And he not only that, he remembered the patient, and he remembered the patient's name. And I began to realize that with just a little more probing, I'm not sure he knew it. He realized it, but that an awful lot of what he knew was based on the patients he treated. He knew those diseases through these people, which is sort of extraordinary and kind of beautiful too. So I think that term memory palace is one that's been used elsewhere, but it did seem like a little palace of memory. And there are so many thousands and thousands of things that can do us in, we human beings. So that's really what I had in mind.
Yeah,
quite extraordinary.
Amazing memory, and I'm sure, Ophelia, you probably had that experience as well. Just maybe being surprised, maybe not, by his capacity to absorb and remember, repeat.
I think at the beginning I probably was surprised, but after a while it became a point of just enormous pride that you knew that. Certainly I tried to stump him a number of times. I'd try and get him super early in the morning and then ask him what the capital of some utterly faraway country that no one really often mentioned. And of course he knew not only what the capital was, but it was still great fun and that sort of thing. But it also did mean that he didn't forget things that you sort of wanted him to forget just occasionally. But that was okay too, because it just meant that he wanted to retain everything he could about those people that he loved. And his patients too. I don't think it's a stretch to say that he tried to love everybody. And so I think part of that was trying to remember a great deal about them. So it was moving. It was moving, even the things I wish he would, forget or not remind me that he had not forgotten, put it that way.
That's right. That sounds very Paul. He cared very deeply. Before I go on to the next question, just as people are coming in and possibly arrived a bit late, just a reminder that you can, if you so choose, watch this with captions on our pih.org/GDOA. And you can see two orange buttons. One says English, the other says hide captions. So if you want to watch this captioned, you can watch in English, Spanish, French, Russian, or Haitian Creole, which is fantastic. Great. So next up, Ophelia, I want to direct this to you first, but I think it's for both of you, really. You have said that Paul's moral clarity really never wavered, and that he usually reflected on one question before taking any action, and that was, is this good for my patient? At PIH, we've absorbed that as a philosophy and have even said our patients are our bosses. Why is that such an important distinction to make, Ophelia, in your opinion?
Well, first, I mean, that moral clarity of his, I have to say, it never, I was going to say rarely, if never came across as somehow arrogant. It felt like a guide star, I think, for many of us, certainly many of us at PIH, who often wanted to look at things that were deeply complex and layered. And I don't mean he had the answer, but there was that guiding principle around, would this be good for our patients? I think goes all the way back to our MO, our deeply held belief in option for the poor. And there's which is really to how do you make a preferential option for the poor and most vulnerable? And I think those patients that you just talked about, sort of keeping them close, those to him were the most vulnerable, particularly in the places where we were working. So it felt like a way for us to be accountable at staying proximal to people. And he felt very strongly that your closeness to a community, to a person, to a family was the thing that was going to keep you focused on them and all that was important to them, to get them well, and well in the broadest possible sense, to make sure they had a shelter, education, that sort of thing. And then I think he was able to pull back and look at, if you're keeping those people proximate to your thoughts, then you can look at pushing bigger levers and having affecting policy, but making sure that you don't ever get to the point where you don't have those people in mind. That was, I think, that's remained for many of us working at Partners in Health, an important guide.
That's such a good point too, because I think Paul walked in all circles, right? So he was with patients, and he was also at the UN. And maybe Tracy, if you wanted to chime in there too on, that importance of staying proximal to the patient or keeping the patient at center.
I was impressed in two ways when I stepped back from it. One is that, as Ophelia said, these questions, if you opened them up for all, in all facets of them, they're incredibly complex, and you could just get stymied and say, well, I don't know what to do. But this was a good guiding principle. And what this also did, it seems to me, was prevented Partners in Health and Paul from ever straying into the question, into the confusing human beings with pins on maps, which is sometimes a problem in public health. And I remember, if I can tell a quick story, I was in Moscow with him. We were with a great man in public health. We had quite a lot of wine, Côte de Rhône, as I recall. It was a cold night. And as Paul had a slight quarrel with the fellow, but with the polite one. And as we left, I took devil's advocate, used to irritate Paul out in that way. But I said, well, the guy's interested in public health. And Paul said, I'm interested in public health too. He said, but what is the public? Is it a family? Is it a village? Is it a state? Is it a country? Is it a whole region of the world, a continent? And I realized that this was the way he moved in his mind when he was thinking of what you were supposed to do in the world. You start with the patient, but you never lose sight of the continent. It's pretty. I don't know. It just seemed the right way to go about things to me.
Right, right.
I was impressed.
I think that also moves into our next question rather well, too, because Paul was someone who he didn't like conflict. That was my sense. He didn't particularly enjoy it, but he definitely got into some good trouble. So he had a knack for making friends with people in high places, too, to achieve a larger goal. So how did that type of rebellious activism make a difference in global health? And Ophelia, if you don't mind addressing that kind of rebellious good trouble.
Yeah, I mean, I would lead with the great strength, which is that he tried to make friends with everybody, and that, you know, for him to become, you know, to get agitated with people, or it would take quite a lot. It happened, but I think that his natural inclination was, how can, you know, even if we may come at this from different ways, why don't we form a partnership? I mean, really, partnership, friendship, getting people together was the chief thing that he thought about all the time, whether it was on an organizational level or personal level. But I saw him many times when I wished he'd get into an argument, because I felt like, you know, the other person would come off much worse. And he often, not by saying, you know, I'm not going to do it, he would show many of us that it was much, much better if you could get around a table with someone and persuade them. And you better keep your powers of persuasion and communication honed so that you could do that. It occasionally didn't work. And then he didn't hold back. And you could usually tell it was, you know, it was coming. Usually his ears got a little bit red, that sort of thing. And you knew that he was about to stir up some trouble. But I would say, I think you're right to focus on good trouble. And I'm not trying to pretend that he didn't get into arguments, or that he didn't feel frustrated by some of the, particularly people in positions of, you know, who had power, who had policy control, who were going to decide whether or not this, you know, country, region, family, person lived or died. And he saw himself as a barrier lifter. And that when people got in the way of that for no good reason, and sometimes that happened just because people would, in his words, you know, answer a question or pose a question in a way that closed the door instead of opening a door. And he could find ways to keep that door open for a long time.
I love that, the barrier lifter and the door opener. Tracy, what do you think about this? How was that good trouble in your experience?
I have to be careful not to. I have a terrible tendency, particularly with Paul and a few other people, to hold them to a much higher standard than I would hold myself. But Paul could be sharp-tongued, and particularly among people it was safe to be sharp-tongued with. I heard a conversation between him and his wonderful friend Jim Kim that was truly shocking to me. It was so agrified, and you know, he was a human being. He was not a perfect, you know, a perfectly controlled person. But Ophelia's right. In my experience of it, the one time that I wasn't there in Durban, South Africa, but there's a famous thing that I got that footage for them when they were making that documentary, and it's when he was debating a man from the World Bank, and the man from the World Bank had said something truly horrifying, which was that if Africans wanted to curb AIDS, they would have to learn to curb their sexuality, something to that effect. And Paul, his ears didn't just turn red, his whole face turned red. And he got up and he said, he tried to mute this by saying, I'm not talking about world bankers, I mean just bankers in general, but I don't think they've been getting enough sex because they've been so busy screwing the world. And the place, it brought down the houses of people here. It was, and that was, you know, he's capable of that. And there were times like men where I wish he'd done it more.
He had a wonderful sense of humor. I mean, that is also a way of delivering a message, right? It's making a point without necessarily
I sense of humor. That was hyper articulate, and he was hilarious.
Yeah,
that was one of the wonderful things about him. I mean, you go to him. He loved his gardening. So you had to go and look at all of the bamboo and other plants and stuff. He called that horticulture. I have a little list of these things that he had names for. He had kept these things called boîte lists, with these lists of things that he had to do. And he would check them off as he did them. But if he'd already done one of them, he'd put it on the boîte list so he could have the pleasure of checking it off. He talked about there ought to be a magazine. What was it, Min? Okay, I should call it. Okay, yeah, Good Hut Keeping was going to be the one. He had. You get to Miami Airport to the Admirals Club, and he talked about getting cavaceous at Amarales. I mean, you'd make what he called a little cave of chairs, and I don't know. It just went on and on.
Almost to the extent, Tracy, that he, and this also comes from his family of origin, and it spreads. It's infectious in that he comes up with new languages, new words. There are so many. I mean, you could almost do a thesaurus of words that the farmer family have come up with that we've all adopted, that sometimes I actually have to remind myself that some other people don't know what we're saying when we say, what check, vivacious.
Right.
Here's one of my favorites. So I was just thinking about it today. I remember him saying to me, there's only one kind of malaria that's deadly, falciparum. So which one do you suppose Haiti has? And then he added brightly, but it's not drug resistant. And then, doing Bill Murray in Caddyshack, he said in the caddy's voice, so we got that going for us. And then by then I knew that I had to answer. I had to add, which is nice. I don't know. It was you had joined that sort of club when you finally figured out what all these things meant. And as you told me once, Ophelia, the family had all kinds of names. He had a different name when he was traveling than he did when he wasn't.
Yeah. His nicknames were different in vacation time and in actual academic time. And perhaps unsurprisingly, that Jim Kim, a co-founder, and Todd McCormack, indulged in this too. So it was almost like a sort of you couldn't find people to work with that really work with who didn't really understand this kind of fabulous zany quality.
Right. That was a lovely part of Paul, for sure. His wicked sense of humor. Today is, as we mentioned in the beginning, is his 64th birthday. What would be his 64th birthday, right? We miss him deeply. You all have mentioned bits and anecdotes and outtakes from a life lived with Paul. Is there any moment that you would want to share now, just thinking about Tracy, maybe some of the time you'd spent alongside him many years ago now, and Ophelia too, going back decades, back to early days in Haiti. And Tracy, maybe we can start with you, if you don't mind.
I have a million small memories, but just to speak about the whole as it goes, washes back over me sometimes, I really have to say that it was, he showed me a part of the world that I didn't know existed, and it was sometimes felt like a harrowing of hell, and yet it was the most exhilarating experience of my life. And there were little ways in which Paul, I remember him really kind of afraid. He was an anthropologist, and sometimes anthropologists get really high-handed, not to say arrogant about their knowledge, but I noticed when I was with the soldiers in Haiti that there were these awful saddles that were made of straw, and they abraded the backs of the animals that were being used. And I said something very cautiously to Paul about these saddles, thinking he'd say, no, these are cultural things, and we can't criticize them or something. He said, oh God, aren't they horrible? Those things are just so terrible. And I felt this enormous relief. I was allowed to describe what I thought I'd seen without being, told, you're not supposed to say that. That was a wonderful characteristic of his, and he was insistently not what we call politically correct. I mean, just, and I wouldn't repeat some of the things he said, but
I was going to say, I mean, that's part of it, right? You so many of these things that felt like they were insider anecdotes. You have to curb yourself a little bit, but that was part of it. It was that creating intimacy between Paul and another person, but the way he could do it actually with a group of people. And so many people were pulled into this, his ability to make a genuine intimacy with everybody. It wasn't sort of like, I'll pretend you're my friend today. It was really, and I think that's why so many people feel today on his birthday that that he, in some ways, they were close to him, and even if they've never met him, his his ideas or his books or the stories about him, and Tracy's book about Paul really pulled people into his life, and maybe even at times to an uncomfortable extent. But I think it was, when I think about anecdotes and sort of outtakes from my time of knowing him, I think about the times when he would pull us all in to be co-conspirators with him, and whether it was somehow managing to get one of us to carry a koi fish from Roslindale to Haiti, and there would be a way to do it, or whether it was a way to get a sample, a medical sample up to a lab from Haiti, that you would be brought into his confidence, the fact that he was asking you to do this, or smuggle some seeds from here and there to, I mean, I think one can use words, but those are the kinds of things when I think back on, I imagine even people watching this, there'll be many people nodding their heads and saying, yeah, I remember when I carried that thing from here to there. And that was a lovely, lovely thing. And it obviously is connected to the gardens that he created that Tracy just alluded to, that really felt deeply important to him. The planting, and wherever he was, that's what he would do. And I think that there's probably not a place that he went to work where there was not a garden of some kind that had been created by him, and hopefully still look robust and wonderful.
Right. And a koi pond, because as you mentioned,
and a koi pond, yes,
big fan of
yeah.
Well, plastic bag works sometimes. Plastic bag with a lot of water.
Yes.
Hard to get it through the security, but hey, it was done.
It was done amazingly in so many different ways. So we have dozens of questions from people who are very excited about this conversation. So I'm going to pull from some of them. I doubt we'll get to all of them, but Tracy, I was hoping you could address this one from Alice Kennedy. Thank you for submitting it, Alice. When making a seemingly impossible decision or facing insurmountable odds, did Paul have a guiding principle, a credo, or a mantra to bolster himself or others during great uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it was that what's best for my patient. And I mean, that can sometimes be it sounds simple, it can sometimes be pretty complicated. But I think, and I think that also went to, I remember once we were on a plane going to South Carolina, and we were having a good old time, and he was being really funny. And then he suddenly realized that on the plane was a PIH supporter who probably wouldn't have been amused, and the whole tone changed. I mean, it was, well, this won't be good for my patients. I really think that was what was guiding him and would sometimes pull him back. But I also think, how did he keep going? That's a question that I can't fully answer it. I know I could wish that he had found more ways to do that, frankly, and to sleep more. I think he was tormented by this is why I see this as Paul was in love with the world. He really loved animals. He loved plants. He loved pretty much everything in the world, and he was in proportion offended by the horrible flaws that were sitting right in front of him, because he put himself in the way of seeing those things. I mean, the Moscow Central Prison, the slums like Al-Sadin, Haiti. I may be not answering this exactly, but I think it was just, and he would say things like, partners enough would get accused of not doing stuff that was sustainable, whatever that meant. And he'd say, what we have to sustain is our is our determination to do this work, our commitment to do it. And I think that was the mantra. How you summon the wherewithal for it, I'm not quite sure, but I always believed that great as he was, wonderful as he was, and seeing around corners and figuring out what should be built and where you should move to and what chances to take next. I feel like the real strength for him came from being a doctor. I think he loved being a doctor first and foremost. And a doctor works with a patient.
Yes. Yeah, and I think maybe, Ophelia, that would be a great segue to pulling you into how does it keep you going? Because that's a question as well that many people seem to have. Caroline in particular says, Ophelia, you were involved in PIH before it existed. From then to now, how has your motivation toward the mission changed? What exactly was the thing, if there was a thing, that kept you at Partners in Health and working?
I mean, I would say that my connection to the mission has only grown stronger. I mean, how can it not go stronger when you see this organization evolve? I mean, there are moments where you wish that things would be a little bit less layered and complicated. But really, I think one of the things that I learned to do from a young age with, in close connection to Paul and Jim and Todd and others, my friends and colleagues in Haiti particularly, is to learn to kind of embrace the complexity instead of trying to push away from it and say, let's try and streamline our mission just a little bit more. Can we just focus on the one or two things? And I think that's one of the most gratifying parts of the work that I have found, that over the years, and maybe it comes with experience and age and that sort of thing, but it feels like, yes, we might crave for the world to be a little less gnarly and complicated, but really that's the piece that's kept me going, because when you see progress against that, however slow it is or however many forward and backward steps the equation involves, you do know that you're moving things forward. And I really do feel as though, for me, a true torture would be to know how all of the complexity and how much suffering there is in the world that could be alleviated, can be alleviated, and not to find some purchase with some group or some people, or just as an individual, making a tiny bit of difference. I think that's what probably keeps me going.
That's fantastic. And Tracy, I don't know if you wanted to mention anything too about why this mission, why this organization that sparked your interest.
Well, I didn't set out to do a good deed. I have to insist on that. I'm gratified that this book has lasted as long as it has, and that it seems to have helped the fortunes of Partners in Health and so on. But that wasn't my aim. I just thought I had a really interesting story, an unusual one, and I wanted to tell it as well as I could. I have to say, though, that in the aftermath, I felt as though I really ought to play whatever little part Ophelia and Paul and Jim wanted me to play, or when, because I had been exposed to something that I really hadn't wanted to acknowledge. And I do believe, there's something so fundamental about health. But Ophelia's right, too, that it's always, just that simple question, what's best for my patient, is an enormously complicated one. And, it doesn't just mean treating illnesses. And it certainly doesn't mean just treating them under mango trees. It means creating a system to treat illness. It means helping people build houses, and on and on. It's really, and doing something about nutrition and maternal mortality. And you don't just take on AIDS or TB, you take on the whole thing. So I'm proud of this organization. I'm proud that it's continued to go on. I'm proud to be connected to it in this small way. Although I think I certainly wouldn't want to be giving the orders.
Well, thank you for saying that too, and being part of this conversation, Tracy. Ophelia, maybe this conversation turns to you again. Layla wants to know, how did you, Paul, Dr. Kim, Todd, and Tom, how did you overcome personal challenges, meaning fights among friends, to focus on the bigger picture of your work? what would you have to say there?
I mean, I feel as though because there was such a foundation of love and trust, which is what, you know, all of us really led with, that if you have a foundation like that, you can really you can do all kinds of things and take risks and be mad at or push one another. As you know, Tracy already mentioned, sort of the explosive arguments that Jim and Paul would have. I think all of us have had those pretty explosive arguments, knowing that what we're trying to do is get to a better solution or a way forward. And it was, so I would say that the overcoming, there was so much love there that even when I tried to, give Paul the silent treatment, he just, he wouldn't even tolerate it for a minute. He would just, overwhelm you with love, which was a really, it was fantastic to be a recipient of that from an early age. So, and then what was the second part of that?
That was just it. I think people were curious, how did you make it work for a while, especially among friends? And Tracy, it looks like you want to jump in too.
I don't know the answer the way, and I'm sure Ophelia's got it all right. The impression I have, I remember going to a great figure in public health, man named Bob Fahey, and he was fascinated. He's the one, I think, really arranged for Partners Not to get one of their big important grants. And he said, it's an interesting organization to have these two powerful intellects in Jim Kim and Paul at the head of it. He said, usually you can't make that work. And he said, I wonder why it is, and I hope it will continue to, something of that effect. And what I didn't say, but what I would have said was, Ophelia, she could keep them from killing each other. And Jim told me that once. I mean, he said something like, she's the one we're really afraid of.
I'm very scary, as you can tell.
Totally. Yeah. Also a giant brain herself. So one other question, Tracy, there are so many questions too about Mountains Beyond Mountains. And, I read Mountains Beyond Mountains and turned to the website and saw that they were hiring 3 writers, and boom, that is the rest of the story. But yes,
hiring 3 writers? Oh.
No, this was years ago. So, but Tracy, you're welcome to apply anytime.
Oh, I see. I'm
Yes. So there are many questions about Mountains Beyond Mountains and just the collection of this mountain of material about it. How can you talk to the what was the most challenging or difficult time, most gratifying or magical moments? People just want to know more about what it was like writing this book.
Well, most of my work, is divided in 2 parts: doing research and then writing. But they always bleed into each other. And I was getting pretty close to finishing a decent draft and I rewrite it about 10, 15 times. So, but I was getting close to the end when I went off to Chiapas with Paul and Ophelia. So it always bleeds in. I take notes, copious notes. I began to use a recorder once in a while, which was particularly useful on one of the journeys I took with Paul on foot, which I used to call the Bataan Death March. That was difficult because I felt I was going to die of thirst. And this was by the time we were starting back from going way up toward the border from Kash. And Paul went off and he started calling the farmers and got me some oranges. But then I ate so many oranges so fast, not to get too I had to find a latrine. And Tijan, one of my favorite people, who sadly is no longer with us either, he found me a good latrine. and on we went. I was so tired. I was the eldest of the group. It's the only excuse that I have. I don't know, but all of those kinds of things really, they kind of fall to the side. I had a few moments with Paul which were difficult, when he seemed to be demanding that I see things in a certain way, or was accusing me. I mean, one time he seemed to be accusing me of having harmed his cause by having written bad things about it, and I hadn't written anything yet. There was, and there were a few times when he seemed to be, what he seemed to be wanting was hagiography, and would actually said, no, you can't write about that. I remember one little moment like that where Ophelia intervened and told him to stop it. But for the most part, he was so much fun to travel with because he was funny. He was considerate. When I got sick, he took care of me. I remember one time in a motel room, he broke his toe because he didn't want to, getting up to go to the bathroom because he didn't want to turn on the light and wake me up. And so it was quite a nice experience. And as for writing well, I mean, I've done that for so long. The one thing I could say is that I usually have a couple of hundred notebooks at least filled when I was doing almost everything by hand, and then a very small percentage gets used. This book I had a much smaller total number of notebooks, but the proportion of stuff that I really wanted, the stories that I really wanted to tell, was much higher. I didn't spend an enormous amount of time with Paul, but when you spent a week with him, it was really like a month. The first trip I took with him was a month. He called it a light month for travel.
Wasn't that one of the titles? I believe.
Yeah. We went to Haiti. We went to South Carolina. We went to Haiti. Then we went to Paris. No, then we were constantly going between there and Miami, and then to Paris, and then to Moscow, and I don't know. I mean, it was, and that was like
right. I mean, I wonder, Ophelia, if you ever knew where he was in all moments. Who knew where he was? He was quite a prolific traveler.
Yeah, he certainly didn't keep tabs on that.
No, nobody could really, except Paul. Another question here, maybe for both of you, and Ophelia, if you don't mind starting. What did Paul say, if anything, about his own legacy? Did you reflect about that at all? And what would he have said?
I mean, we didn't spend a lot of time reflecting on legacy. I think, maybe another way to think about it is what he cared about deeply was, would there be, I mean, the thing we've often heard referred to as his retirement plan. And I think that the work that he put into with colleagues, making sure that partnerships were made with PIH and other organizations, certainly the Brigham Women's Hospital, certainly Harvard Medical School, and a host of other places, organizations, academic institutions, and making sure that there were students trained to become professors in epidemiology and infectious disease and all, across the board. I think that he felt as though the best thing that he could do would be to make sure that there was an action plan and a group of people who would be part of carrying that mission forward. And that he and others did really beautifully. We have colleagues and friends who are part of that and carry the mission forward and do so in a really systemic way, rather than making sure that we only have volunteers to do this. It's to create a system. And I feel like that is one of the most shining examples of his legacy, because obviously investing in teaching and teachers and professors and academics and researchers, that means that this will go on and on and on.
That's great. And Tracy, too, what do you think on that same topic, his legacy?
He once told me that what he wanted to do, and this was in the moment of some anguish, where I'd written this profile of him for the New Yorker, and somebody just filled with moral envy had written something nasty, and I shouldn't even have told him about it, but I did. And he said, all I wanted to do was start a movement. And and it wasn't. And I think as for the legacy of leaving this team, this group, this growing group behind, he had what seemed to me a pretty precise plan, but it was kind of guided by, I think, by the priorities of whatchamacallit, theology.
Liberation theology.
Right, theology, geez. Sorry. You know, I forget which comes first. It's sort of drawn from Matthew 25, but there are prisoners in there, and patients are in there, and students are big in there. And he I don't know how many papers there were total in his life, but he stopped being, his name was just become incidental. He promoted his students, and he had very precise places he wanted them to be, and he wanted them to have power in the system. So that, you know, it was ingenious, and I think it was, and I think it worked.
And speaking of students, we actually have a question through YouTube. And the question is from Andres. Andres says, I am an MD PhD student. I'm currently struggling to balance my passion for health equity in medical training with that of my PhD training. Sounds like some people who are meant for a PhD path, possibly. They seem so disconnected, those two. Any advice? Maybe, Ophelia, what do you think? The question is, you know, how do I balance that health equity with medical training, or, you know, and PhD?
I imagine, from knowing a few academics who are passionate about applying what it is that they're studying, that Paul felt certainly at the time that those two things would complement each other. And I really do think that they did. The research that he was able to do as a PhD student and served him forever. It really did. His ability to be able to use that to bolster all of the other pieces, including making him a better clinician, a more knowledgeable caregiver, and also, I think, to be pretty strategic. He realized that having a PhD would allow him to do certain things that would, including teaching, that would influence things for the long term. So though I believe that his greatest, I would say to him pretty regularly, are you doing the things now that you really love doing? And he said that the things that I want to do are reading, writing, being around patients, and teaching. He was very clear about that. There was, he didn't, much as he loved gardening and all of that kind of thing, that, when I talked about the work that he was doing, that's what he focused on. And I think that being able to do those things he was very clear about that. So teaching, really, he felt was the way forward. And I don't think you can do that, at least in the sort of capacity that the person who asked that question, I think, focus on what he wants to do with it later.
Tracy, did you have anything to add there too?
I agree. I think you can. I think you got to, if you want to be a good doctor to the poor, you better be a good doctor. For one thing, they're not going to be able to usually get second opinions. That somebody once said, David Walton, I think, said that. But yeah, you don't try to jump too fast into this. You get trained, get good at it. And remember, I think one little bit of advice I would give to younger people, almost everyone's younger than I am now, but would be, don't try to be Paul Farmer. That's not the idea, and I'm pretty sure Paul would say the same. Not everyone can do that, but try to help and try to find your way to it. I remember someone criticizing people who went into optometry or something, and Paul would point out, said, well, poor people have eyes too, So it's.
I agree. That also makes me think of, actually, if people are interested in that question. So we recently updated the pih.org/Paul page, and you'll see a section about Paul's research. And so specifically, we added some information from his curriculum vitae narrative for Harvard, and it talks about all his research questions, and that drove his clinical and his academic work. So if you're curious about, those underlying areas that inspired him and what he did, that's one way to think about how to blend that medical with the PhD focus. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but we have 4 minutes left. So one more question, if I may.
As Paul would say, we just got going.
We just got going. Can we do this? And you'd always say, can we do this again? And I would say, tomorrow, Paul, let's do this tomorrow. So the last question is really something that many, many people have asked in one form or another, but for his birthday, now and into the future, we want to honor Paul through action. What are some ways that people watching, listening today can take meaningful steps to ensure that health is a human right for all? What can we do? And Ophelia, if you don't mind starting off and then moving to Tracy.
While I don't have a list of things that would be useful, my sense is that people really do have a good sense of what it is that they can do. I think sometimes, to Tracy's point, people tend to focus on the enormity of the issues and feel quickly overwhelmed. John Green said in a conversation with Paul that people's attention is very important. And I focus on that because I think that when there are so many issues pulling at our attention, I think deciding what it is that interests you and going deep, reading about it, becoming interested, realizing that you can change by being in touch politically, locally, politically, by using your heft and muscle, which is considerable. If you're writing, as Paul would say, if you're writing that question, you already have quite a bit of agency, and sort of finding ways to use that. That's really what I would focus on. And the second thing would be to keep at the front and center of everything this notion of equity. And if you're asking yourself that question as you write to your congressperson, your mayor, or indeed getting involved in any organization, just keep that.
Could I put a pitch in too for?
Yes.
Look hard at medicine as it's evolving now in our country. It's not going in a good direction at all. It's going kind of a horrible one, and you might want to start to sink your teeth into that because it will affect the way things are done in Haiti and elsewhere. And I would go to the PIH website and look for if you're looking for some things in particular to do, go there. Volunteer. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff you can do.
It was such a great segue, Tracy, because I was going to say, well, number one, thank you. Thank you so deeply, Tracy, Ophelia, for spending an hour with us. Thank you to everyone who watched and listened and sent in questions. And as Tracy said, please visit us at pih.org. You can find ways to get involved. There's a volunteer button and ways to advocate. You can also follow us on many different social media channels. We're there on all of the channels, but Instagram, Facebook, what was known as Twitter, and all the many different ways that we can connect. Please follow us there. And if you do have an opportunity, donate. Consider a donation in honor of Paul today. Thank you again, Ophelia, Tracy. I hope we get to do this again. Thanks to everybody. Tomorrow. All right, it's a deal.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, TK.
Thank you. Thank you,
And
man.
thanks to everybody watching. Really, I can't help but realize how much this would mean to Paul and to everyone who loved Paul. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye-bye.